Hello. I am Judy Regensteiner. I'm a professor of medicine here at UC Anschutz, and I am also the director of the Center for Women's Health Research. And with my colleague, Chiara Delmonico from UC Health, we're going to sponsor this program, although Dr. Winia, one of our speakers, is going to be the Master of Ceremonies tonight. Just to tell you, I want to thank you so much for coming out on this less than beautiful evening. Sorry about that. It always makes me mad when it snows on a day which I have an event because I figure how dare it, but it dares. So thank you all for coming, and we really appreciate it. The Center for Women's Health Research sponsors the Let's Talk series along with UC Health, our wonderful partners, because of our three-part mission where we do cutting-edge research in women's health. We also train and mentor the next generation of young researchers, young physicians, MD and PhD scientists who want to have a career in women's health or study sex differences, and we educate the public and healthcare providers. It's in that third role that I'm here tonight. I'm so thrilled to see all of you, and I look forward to a really excellent program.
I think Dr. Regensteiner said it all. Thank you. Dr. Winia, please come up and be our MC for tonight.
Thank you all so much for being here, and I just want to echo my appreciation for the Center for Women's Health Research and UC Health for coming together to put this program together for the community and for folks here on the medical campus. This topic tonight matters to a lot of people. I presume it matters to everyone in this audience, and it matters to many, many people beyond this audience. My task tonight is mainly to introduce a couple of pretty amazing people. I'm going to start by introducing you to Dr. Brenda J. Allen, who is the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Colorado, Denver, and also the Anschutz Medical Campus. So her responsibilities cross both campuses. She is a nationally known expert on implicit bias, author of a groundbreaking book called Difference Matters: Communicating Social Identity. And she's won pretty much every award there is to win for teaching and advocacy at the University of Colorado, including awards from CU Boulder. She is the recent winner of the Elizabeth Gee Award for Outstanding Faculty Member Efforts to Advance Women in Academia and interdisciplinary scholarly contributions and distinguished teaching. And I've seen Dr. Allen speak 2 or 3 times over the last couple months, and you are in for a tremendous treat.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to everyone who put together this phenomenal event. I am extremely pleased to talk with you tonight about demystifying and defining implicit bias under our broad topic of implicit bias matters. And to get us going, I'm going to show a brief video. It's about 4 minutes long, and it is interactive, so I expect you to, they're going to ask you to do some things. Are you going to play along? Oh, good. Look at that enthusiasm. So I want you to play along with the video, and afterwards, just reflect on how many of you have done any implicit bias training before? So some of you have, some of you haven't. And regardless of whether you have or you haven't, as you view this video, just think about how is that relevant to our overarching topic of implicit bias matters, and then to my role tonight, which is to define and demystify it. Okay? Please.
You may not realize it, but your brain actually processes information in 2 very distinct ways. Like when you look at this photo, you instantly know she has blonde hair, is visibly angry, and likely has some choice words to yell. Without any effort, you experienced fast thinking. But if you look at the following problem, something different happens. Sure, you immediately know it's a multiplication problem, and you knew you could solve it if you had the energy, but didn't. If you do try, your muscles will tense, your pupils will dilate, and your heart rate will increase. Now, you've experienced slow thinking. These 2 systems of fast and slow thinking dictate much of our perception and reaction in life. Take these lines for example. It's clear that they're different lengths. but if you measure them, they're actually the exact same length. Even now that you know, System 1 or your fast thinking can't stop seeing the illusion because it acts automatically. A similar effect is seen here. Which figure is the largest? Again, they're all the same size, but the suggestion of perspective and depth causes your System 1 to interpret the picture as three-dimensional, even though it's on a flat two-dimensional surface. It's making quick work of the available information, and so your conscious System 2, or slow thinking, must compensate after the fact and choose not to believe your intuition or instinct. Want to see your System 2 in action? I'll show you a string of 4 digits, you read them aloud, then add 1 to each of the original digits. If the card reads 3795, the correct response would be 4806. We'll then go to the next card and you'll do the same, followed by the next card. Ready? Go. Few people can cope with more than 4 digits, but even harder is add 3. The interesting bit is that though your pupils would have dilated, you often become effectively blind when you fully engage System 2. Did you notice the color of the text change? Or how about the fact that the numbers completely changed when I put them off to the side? Listen to the following puzzle. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Chances are your System 1 intuition was yelling 10 cents, but this appealing System 1 answer we know is wrong. In fact, the correct answer is 5 cents. Even if you worked out the correct answer, you likely thought of 10 cents along the way. System 1 is trying to work out an answer as quickly and seamlessly as possible, which is extremely beneficial in everyday life. If every activity required full mental effort, it would be exhausting. But knowing this allows us to understand that not all of our first impressions are correct. How many animals of each kind did Moses take into the ark? So few people detect what is wrong with this question that it's been dubbed the Moses illusion. In fact, Moses took no animals, Noah did. Again, our brain invests as little resources as necessary so that things run quickly and smoothly. Because Moses is not abnormal in the biblical context, System 1 unconsciously detects an association between Moses and ark and quickly accepts the question. In a similar way, System 1 generates context without you knowing. Reading each of the following may seem fairly simple. A, B, C, Anne approached the bank, and 12, 13, 14. But your brain actually interpreted these ambiguous statements without you ever knowing. You could have read it as A, 13C, or 12, B, 14, but your brain created the context unconsciously. Also, you likely imagined a woman with money on her mind walking towards a building with tellers. But if the sentence before this was, they were floating gently down the river, the entire scene would have changed because bank is no longer associated with money. Without an explicit context, System 1 quickly generates one based on previous experience. In this case, you've likely visited more banks than rivers, and so the context is resolved accordingly. This ties into a concept called priming. For example, if I said wash, how would you complete this word fragment? Most would see soap, but had I just shown you the word eat, you'd be more likely to see soup. In this way, both eat and wash prime your thoughts. Though System 2 likes to think that it's in charge and knows what's going on, the truth is that priming effects have even been shown to affect and modify behavior. These arise in System 1, and you have no conscious access to them. If you'd like to learn more about the thinking systems in your brain, check out the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which covers it in great detail. I'll put a link in the description which you can check out. Got a burning question you want answered? Ask it in the comments or on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe for more weekly science videos.
As I said, I wanted you to engage with that video, anticipating that we're going to talk about implicit bias matters. And in situations where I have more than 30 minutes to engage with audiences, I actually invite some ideas about how it's relevant. Because we don't have that much time this evening, I just want you to just pause for a moment and think about how it's relevant, and then I'll tell you how it is. So the takeaway here is, as you see, it says brain tricks. This is how our brain works, is when we think about implicit bias, to understand the actual process that we undergo is one that's part of neuroscience. It's how our brains work. It's how we've been socialized. In certain situations, there's a stimulus response, could be one way of looking at it. It's also that frequently we are just wanting to get things done. We're not stopping to really analyze. So this is an important way to begin our conversation. As I invite you, for my time again is to define and demystify. And in defining and demystifying, under that broad notion of helping us all understand implicit bias matters, that is to say it is something significant, it matters, and there are different matters or issues we need to think about. And what I hope is by the time we're done this evening, you really understand more deeply how and why it matters, and you have ideas of what to do to mitigate implicit bias. So let's start then with fully defining implicit bias. And of course, it's a qualifier, implicit and then bias. And it's important to understand that bias is not a four-letter word. Well, it is, but it's not like a bad word. Bias refers very simply to, and I can't help myself, I've got to get some audience participation. What does bias mean to you, just in everyday terms? Anybody? Bias. Prejudgment. Prejudgment. Predisposition. Fabric, bias, it's like, really, and that's actually relevant to this, right? It's a particular slant, if you will. So bias in and of itself is something we all have predispositions, preferences, prejudgments about many things in life. How many of you have a favorite color? Can you guess mine? You would be wrong, it's purple. As the queen of the universe, I can't help but have purple as my favorite color, the modest queen of the universe. So bias then refers to prejudgments, ways that we have predispositions about anything in life. And that bias can be qualified as implicit or explicit. So when I say to you, what's your favorite color? If you have one, you know it, that's explicit and conscious. Implicitly, you may tend toward certain colors and not even realize it, and others may point it out to you. So it's important to make that initial distinction of implicit, explicit, conscious, unconscious. And a lot of work in this area actually refers to unconscious bias, but I've tended to prefer to talk implicit because with unconscious, it may seem so very hard to get to because it's unconscious, and implicit means it's implied somehow. So implicit bias, to be even more specific, it refers to attitudes or stereotypes about other human beings that unconsciously affect our understanding, actions, and decisions. Here's where, again, this distinction is important for our purposes this evening, because remember I said biases, and we said biases refer to any preferences or prejudgments or preconceptions or tendencies. What we're talking about more specifically is how those operate when it comes to other human beings. Moreover, we're talking about them as it refers to stereotypes or prejudgments that then can affect what we do. These are activated involuntarily and without our awareness or intentional control. They reside deep in our subconscious, and we have to work hard to become aware of them. The very good news is we can become more aware, especially if we become committed to mitigating these implicit biases. And imagine, where do these come from? Let me give you an example. Earlier this year, I was very pleased to actually contract with a person who is a member of an underrepresented background. And I'm not even going to tell you the background because I think sometimes by us stating stereotypes related to groups, that actually can help perpetuate. But just trust me, I was very pleased that I was able to contract with a person from an underrepresented background. And as I was thinking about the relationship with that person, I found myself saying, and I'm going to have that person send me a report every week to delineate how the hours were used. And I caught myself, because this is not the first time I've had this type of contract. And I had trusted the other persons in that role to just log their time in, because most of the work is virtual, log their time in, no questions asked. When I stopped and thought about it, there I was again doing what I call TUI, thinking under the influence of stereotypes. Because I couldn't come up with any other reason why suddenly now I want something different with this person. even though I know better, even though, as you've heard, I do this work, et cetera. And I share that with you, for one, to hope if there's any reservation on your part in terms of, wow, I don't want to know that I have the biases. We all do. And it's important to try to catch yourself so you can do something about it. So my point is that we're all likely to have implicit biases. And it's important to think about, where in the world do they come from? Where do you think they come from, these stereotypes or assumptions about different groups of people? Anyone? Family, media, culture, religion, education. I mean, it goes on and on. And it's not only from once we're born, but research shows that babies in the womb, if one knows the baby using the traditional binary, if you know the baby's sex, you begin to engage and interact with that baby, socializing that person before they're even born. So it's from cradle, it's from in vitro to death that we are getting these these messages about stereotypes. So we harbor them in our unconscious, and they can cause us to have feelings and attitudes about other people based on various characteristics. And here are just some of those categories related to implicit bias. You can take a look at them. And if I asked you, if I pointed to any one of those and asked you, could you name stereotypes about labels that fall under them? How many of you, if you can raise your hand, how many of you could, I don't want you to do it, but how many of you could readily say stereotypes based on, if we did race and I gave you a specific category under race, especially the non-dominant or those that there's a history of discrimination against, typically there are many more stereotypes and they're negative than for the dominant group, which is not to say there aren't any as well for the dominant group. So my point is, they're in there. And going back to the video, we harbor those. And I love that verb, harbor, those kinds of notions of other human beings, even when they're contrary to our actual belief systems. So the example I gave to you, I definitely do not know in my heart of hearts that I'm prejudiced against persons in the category of that person with whom I made a contract. But I do know I've been socialized since I was a kid. Let's take the idea of race. So when I was a little kid, little colored kid, as we were called colored those days, living in the projects in Youngstown, Ohio, we little colored kids would sing, so when you're white, you're right, and if you're brown, stick around, but if you're black, ooh baby, I'll get back, I'll get back, I'll get back. And in fact, one of the worst things we could call one another, let's say if I was gonna call Ronald a jerk, if I called him a black jerk, that was like the ultimate insult. So we were teaching ourselves colorism and internalized racism. So it's no wonder that when I took, just the other day, I took an implicit association test. If you're not familiar with them, I'll be talking with you about it a bit later as something to do. I took the implicit association test on race and found, no surprise to me, that I have a moderate association of white people with positive and good and black people with negative and bad. And again, so contrary to my whole lived experience, and yet it's in there. So my point is, of all these categories and even ways that they intersect, we have been taught these well-learned sets of associations between some trait in a social group, which is what a stereotype is, that affects us whether we're aware of it or not. And this has implications for many things across life. And before I get deeper into that, let me share with you some of the actual conditions for bias, because those are important. What I want you to do is to keep track, if you haven't already, of what might you do to mitigate implicit bias, you personally, you individually. And one of the things to do is understand, well, what are the conditions under which you're likely to unconsciously, that system one, right, make a decision or do something based on how we've been taught to associate traits with human beings based only on their identity categories. One is emotional states. And that's across the range. You could be very happy about something, and because you're feeling that euphoria, et cetera, and you're making a decision or a snap judgment, you might be more likely to tap into those stereotypes. Similarly, ambiguity. If there's no clarity in what you're trying to do at any given point, you're really likely to go with a snap judgment. Remember that notion of priming? It'd be a situation in which here's how we do things around here. And typically how we do things around here are based on dominant group kind of value systems, et cetera, and are now left unquestioned. So if there's not that clarity, for example, we are going to be very specific about looking for applicants. Let's say we're hiring. We're looking for applicants who have a proven track record of working with diverse populations, which is very different than saying we're looking for a person in terms of their embodiment. So that's a criterion. But if we haven't made that specific, and if we're not tracking how we are engaging the decision-making, we're going to be likely to lapse into typical ways of judgment. Similarly, distracted conditions, high-pressure contexts, and lack of feedback. So I have the colleagues with whom I work and the persons who report to me know I want them to give me feedback on these issues. Earlier this year, after a staff meeting, a female staff member came up and said, Dr. Allen, I noticed during the meeting that you tended to call on the men in the room more than the men. Excuse me, the men in the room more than the women. And you can imagine my response. Haven't you heard I got the GE award for working with women, so that couldn't have happened. Kidding. Actually, my response was, thank you very much. And by the way, this is important too, in terms of if someone gives you feedback, that there's a sense that something has occurred, it's important for you to be gracious, even if you think it through and realize maybe they're off base. But that's important in this work because that's a way of showing respect and valuing others. So soliciting that feedback is really crucial. But typically we don't have that kind of feedback built in. So with that, let's think a bit about why does implicit bias matter? And once again, if we had time, I'd ask for some of your ideas. I want you to be thinking about them. Thank you. So it matters because, as I've said, it can influence our attitudes and behavior. It shapes our perceptions and our decision making. It's often incompatible with our conscious values. And it can help perpetuate inequities. It can help us neglect to reap the benefits of being inclusive of a wide variety of persons in our various settings. It can influence healthcare interactions, as I'll share in a moment in terms of some of the research. And that way, we miss out on people being innovative, being loyal, being creative, their morale, job satisfaction, patient compliance, how much patients and others actually share information. I'm sure you understand we could go on and on with that. And the research actually upholds this. This particular one that I show up here is a very good resource because it shows a nice summary of recent work, specifically in healthcare. However, this growing body of research covers everything from social justice to education, to healthcare, to employment in general, to housing, and it uses methods such as simulation, experiments. Have you heard of the resumes, the sounding name studies? Black sounding names versus white sounding names, male sounding names versus female sounding names. Now they're doing them with Arab Muslim sounding names versus Eurocentric. If you're not familiar with the work, it's highly scientific and everything's the same except the name. And by the way, the persons are much more likely, a higher percentage, to go with, because they're making that association, to go with members of the dominant groups than the non-dominant groups, regardless of whether or not they are a member of that group. So that means I, as a Black woman, might be likely to prefer a white-sounding name or a male-sounding name than a Black or Latinx, et cetera. You get where I'm going with that. So there's a wealth of research that looks at even across, thinking about the healthcare system, it looks like everything from students entering into professions, their attitudes about, for instance, Black people have a higher tolerance for pain, or Latinx people are less likely to, right? So they come in with that, and it also affects admissions processes. It affects once you're in the healthcare profession, it goes on and on and on. Who gets appointed, who gets mentoring, who gets research projects, what people say on resumes. There's a wealth of the research, which is pretty impressive and important to understand that we can do something about it. And it's important for you, I want you to really think about whatever your particular area is. If you're not familiar with the research, there's probably some research on it. When I'm invited to work with groups and do a full-on workshop, I do homework. So I just did, the CU Student Nurses Association invited me, and lo and behold, earlier this week, there's actually research, well, it showed that a Pearson textbook had appalling information in it that was stereotyping racial ethnic groups. And no one had caught it because of, I think it's implicit bias. I hope it's that rather than explicit. But once it was called and they got the feedback, they pulled it. And that was very commendable. So what to do? Remember that we all have biases. Do you have biases? Yes or no? Say, I do. I do. And commit to managing your biases. I bold the your because sometimes in these situations, people say, well, I just wish my boss was here, or I just wish so-and-so was here. So I'm like, you're here. You're here. It starts with each one of us individually. We really can make a difference in this regard. And recognize that we can learn more. We're in such a wonderful age where there's so much information. There's a wealth of information available. Be mindful of TUI, which is what? Thinking under the influence. That's from Brenda J. Allen, Difference Matters. And if you catch yourself thinking under the influence, redirect your guilt or your shame. That's what I do, because I continue to catch myself. And then I said, okay, so I'm such a product of this environment. I'm such a product of, the messages implicit and explicit, and I can do something about it. Does my thought that could be deemed as racist does not make me racist. My thought is not me. Slow down. Develop cultural humility. Recognize and we all are multicultural beings, so we have culture based on our gender, race, social class, nationality, whatever our professions are. I define culture broadly. So have humility that whatever your cultures are, there are also other cultures, and so to be humble about that. Solicit and offer feedback. The implicit association test, again, I encourage you to check them out if you haven't already. I just did the one I told you on race and found out still I tend to prefer white people over, or associate white people with good and black people with bad, and they have a lot of other tests along those lines. Individuate. View each person as a full, complex human being. By the way, this doesn't mean that just think where we're all the human race, right? I don't want to go that relative, but just for instance, if I were to engage with you based on your name, based on how you're dressed and so forth, I might have some sense of particular aspects of identity. And perhaps socio-psychological research says that we tend to see in Western culture race, ethnicity, and gender, and maybe age, right? Even though people want to say, I don't think of you as black as white, too bad, because I really do, right? And it's a good thing for me. But as I view you, I may think I have some ideas about those basic categories, and those matter. So not saying to deny, right, if I see you and think I have a sense of your race or gender, but rather to also think, and there's so much more that I can't know, just as you can't know about me. So individuate is important. Seek counter stereotypes. If you're aware of certain stereotypes, intentionally look for something that goes against that. And when you find those counter stereotypes, imagine there are thousands more like that, rather than leaning toward thinking, well, that's an exception, right? That's an exceptional person. To think about there are thousands others out there. Control the conditions. Platinum rule, who knows what that is? As treat others as they want to be treated. So in your toolbox, you can have the golden rule, do unto others as you have them do unto you, and the platinum rule. The platinum rule requires work on your part to try to understand, right, and value how do others want to be treated. And that's a really good way at actually connecting with your biases. For instance, one way to realize you might be biased is, as I gave my example of checking myself. Another way is, if you're engaging with somebody or you hear someone say or do something, you find yourself thinking, wow, that person knew that or said that. That might mean you're being biased. You have an implicit bias. If you're surprised that a person is capable in a certain way and you can only locate a difference in terms of some of their identity. And by the way, I hope you see, as I'm sharing with you, to accept this as a wonderful challenge to do better in the world. Not as something for you to feel burdened with, but rather excited about, that you can make a difference when it comes to these issues. Work within your sphere of influence. No matter who you are, there's someone that you can influence through your behaviors. So just think about that, and again, accept it as a wonderful assignment. There are many other things that can be done. I share with you what to do at the individual level. When I work again with groups, I go in more detail for this one about strategic approaches and processes and promising practices. Certainly, the more professional development and learning and growing one does, the more of a difference it can make. So as you think then about what we're covering this evening, Implicit Bias Matters, I hope that regardless of how much you thought it mattered before my presentation, you feel even more deeply that it does matter. I hope also I have illuminated some of the issues that do matter, and furthermore, provided some ideas in terms of what you can do. Starts with each of us individually, and we can really make a difference, in particular thinking about reducing health disparities, striving for health equity. And by the way, this is not just about thinking about patient and services and so forth in healthcare, but thinking about the kind of workplaces we have as we engage with one another. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allen. That was wonderful. We are very fortunate tonight to have Dr. Matt Winia, Director of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at CU Anschutz Medical Campus, present a challenging and thought-provoking case study. Dr. Winia is a physician specializing in internal medicine and infectious disease and has a special interest in exploring everyday challenges in healthcare and health policy, and founded the American Medical Association's Center for Patient Safety. Additionally, he was the Director of Patient and Physician Engagement for AMA's Improving Health Outcomes. And among his many talents, Dr. Winia has been a professional actor appearing on stage in many Shakespeare plays. He is now host of a novel podcast series called Hard Call, which he explores the toughest healthcare decisions. We are really excited to hear you speak. Thank you, Dr. Winia.
Thank you. But for this talk, I'm going to ask you to pull your phone out, okay? And I'm going to ask you to just test out the system with me here. This is an audience polling system. It's done by text message. So pull out your phone. What you're going to do is text AMCSOM. And you're going to send that message to the number 37607. So in the to box, you're going to put 37607, and the message you're going to send is AMCSOM. My mic is cutting out. Once you do that, you will get a text message back. Are you starting to get text messages back? Okay, once you have received the text message back, you can answer my question. How old are you? Easy question. We're going to start with an easy question. Are you extremely young? If so, just text A to 37607. So just reply to the message that you just got back. Or text A and hit reply. If you are not very young but still quite young, then text B. If you are not quite young but you are definitely young, because you're in my group, then you would text C. And if you're pretty youngish, you would text D. Okay? So I'm going to go forward here and see, we've got about 54 people. By the way, if you are in the, if you're in the audience outside of here, you can still vote. So I don't know if you guys can see me up on the screen here. You guys, you can vote too. Just do the same thing, text AMCSOM to the number 37607, and you can vote. Yeah, see, we're getting a bunch more votes. Okay, so let's see what we got here. Oh, so we have a nice spread. Okay, next question. Because we tonight are talking about implicit bias and gender, I would like to get a sense of who is in the audience with regard to gender. And apologies, I understand very well that there are more than 3 categories. I'm putting 3 up because we don't have enough time. So if you consider yourself female, A, male, B, other, or a third gender, C. All right, people are getting good at this. We got 70 responses right off the bat. All right, as expected for a talk about implicit bias and, okay, and the last one, not the last one, but the last one of these sort of basic questions, I'm going to be giving you someone's story, and it's the story of a man with a serious mental illness. And so I like to start this by asking how prevalent serious mental illness is within the families and friends and amongst ourselves in the audiences that I talk to. So in the last year, just in the last year, have you or someone you love experienced a mental illness? These conditions are among, if not the, most prevalent conditions that we see in healthcare. And we often don't notice them, right? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to use this podcast that we do called Hard Call. And the idea of the Hard Call podcast is that we tell real people's stories. I was asked to do this, even though the story I'm going to tell you is the story of a man with mental illness. And I realize this is about women's health and well-being. But it's a real story, so I can't really change it. Instead, what I'm going to do is say a couple words about the ways in which stereotypes, bias, and stigma intersect between gender and mental illness, and then we'll talk about the story. I just like this slide because I've lived in cheesesteak. I've lived in yes sir and yes ma'am. I grew up as a rainy hipster, and now I live in the snow. So there are all kinds of stereotypes, right? So what are some of the stereotypes, and these aren't good or bad, what are some of the common stereotypes? You all know these. What are some of the stereotypes? Just text a word, and it will show up in our word cloud, and we'll create a word cloud together. Emotional, nurturing, mothers, moody, flighty, weak, brilliant, maternal, unstable, neurotic. I haven't seen hysterical yet, but that's sort of a classic blending of female physiology and stereotyping of mental illness. So you'll see this conflation of stereotypes about women, some of which are good, positive, what you might call positive stereotypes. Let me just skip forward and say that even positive stereotypes can sometimes be a problem, right? So the idea that we all know women are nurturing, they're more caring, that will affect the behavior of women sometimes in counterproductive ways because they don't want to go against the stereotype of being nurturing and caring. And that may prevent a woman from behaving appropriately in some circumstances. And by the way, the opposite is even probably more true. The idea that men might avoid that kind of behavior, which is positive behavior and desirable, for fear of looking female or feeling female or being seen as female. Just a quick word on the difference, and Brenda mentioned this already, between stereotyping and bias. Stereotyping is a belief about a group, right? So white men can't jump, that's a stereotype. A bias is a preference, often based on a stereotype. So if you say white men can't jump, you're a white man, I don't want you on my basketball team. That is a bias. That is acting on a bias, right? Implicit bias, as we've learned, is either a positive or negative mental attitude towards a group or an individual member of that group that a person holds at a subconscious level. So we've talked about this already. I won't go into it in more detail, but I do want to say a word about stigma, because stigma is a particular type of bias. Stigma is a common negative bias that many people hold. And stigma, comes from the Greek, stigmata, right? A mark. So a stigma is a mark. So the scarlet letter, classic stigma, right? The stigmata of Christ on the cross, right? It's a physical mark. There are many stigmata, however, there are many things that are subject to stigma where you can't see it, right? So it's hard to hide the fact that you are female. Not impossible, but it's not easy for most people to hide what their gender is. So that is a visible stigma. Mental illness is often an invisible stigma. It is a subject of invisible stigma. And this is the final point I wanted to make before telling you the story, which is that stigma and social power structures are inextricably interlinked. So it is very common for people to be subject to multiple stigma. So the woman who's being stepped on is probably depressed. And so she's being stepped on twice, even if she's depressed because she's being stepped on. So let me play with you. Now, I do have to say, I'm about to play you a clip, and I'm going to play several clips from this podcast. If raw language bothers you, I apologize in advance. But these are clips, and so I'm gonna just start. And I picked this one in part because we give the.
Are we taping?
We are taping.
So we should start by doing this disclaimer.
Yes.
This episode of Hard Call contains harsh language, including the use of multiple ethnic slurs and swear words.
Do we need to say it's not recommended for children, or is it obvious?
I think that's obvious. When you say multiple ethnic slurs and swear words.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
How you doing?
How are you, sir?
Jeff Zen.
Carlos, nice meeting you.
Carlos, nice to meet you. What do you do, Carlos?
I'm a sewing machine mechanic.
Are you?
Yes,
Who
I
do you
am.
work for? Anyone?
On my own. I work on my own.
Do you?
Yes.
Good for you. Your business for yourself?
Yes, sir.
Congratulations.
Thank you,
Are
sir.
you doing well? You making money?
I just started. I've been working.
I just started my business.
I just
Very
worked in the
good.
garment center for 20 years. So.
For 20 years and you went out on your own?
I went out on my own.
Congratulations. I went in the garment center for 31 years and just started business. Are you happy? Are you excited?
I am. I've been involved in this business for so long. I like it, It's my life. It's been my life, so.
Congratulations, and I want you to know, if you ever need a favor, if you ever need anything, you come to the 28th floor and you talk to me. If anyone ever gives you trouble, if anyone ever gives you a problem, you come talk to me, okay? Because you know who I got behind me? I got the Leboviches, I got the rabbis, I got the Jews, I got the Italians, I've got the lesbians, I've got the Haitians, I got the Voodoos, I got the 150,000 Chinese employees. You know what I got behind me? I got the power of God. I've got the Word.
I'm going to.
And so do you. I can tell you're a man of God, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Absolutely you are. And a man of God is a man of God to me. It doesn't matter if you're Chinese, Jewish, Arabian. I don't care what you are, as long as you believe in God. As long as you don't try to hurt people, as long as you're a good person, you're on my team. You're on my side. And I'll protect anybody who believes that. You want to fuck with me, you fuck with everybody, okay? And then you want to fuck with you, you're going to fuck with me.
Okay.
How's you doing there? My pleasure, sir. Thanks for coming up, okay?
So that's Jeff Zinn. What serious mental illness is Jeff most likely experiencing right now? Right. So, so Jeff, as I said, real guy. Jeff is a successful businessman at the time of this, at the time of his initial mania episode. He is starting a business in the garment district in Manhattan. He's a millionaire at this point. And one of the things that a millionaire with mania can do is hire a film crew to follow him around because he thinks his life story is that compelling that it should be made into a reality TV show. So he hired a film crew to follow him around, and that's how we got the tape of Jeff as he descended into his manic break. Jeff's wife eventually, after he gives away $100,000 to charity because he's in connection with God, and God has told him that he'll get tenfold back anything he gives away. His wife thinks that that is a danger to them. And although he has never threatened to hurt her physically, nor has he threatened to hurt himself physically, she believes that he is going off the rails, and she tricks him into going to see a psychiatrist. She says, "We need marriage counseling." So he arrives at the marriage counseling session. The psychiatrist knows that she's evaluating him for whether he needs to be hospitalized. He clearly will not want to be hospitalized. And this is the first question that we ask at the end of episode 1. And I apologize, I'm going really fast on this because I want to get to episode 2.
He was just starting a new business, in fact, and a psychiatrist was trying to decide if this man
I got the biggest reputation this industry has ever had. I'm rocking the foundation of this world.
needed to be hospitalized, or if his wife was just mad at him.
Because she only talked about the money. He just gave away $100,000. I said, okay, so people lose millions. You know, it's only money. I mean.
So this is the question we ask at the end of the episode, and we talk a little bit about the reasons why someone might be hospitalized against their will, some of the ethical issues associated with making that decision. So I'm going to ask you all to go ahead and make this decision. What would you do if you were the psychiatrist and you had him in your office? He's about to walk out. He's acting like you've heard, quite manic, but he hasn't hurt anyone. But he has given away $100,000. His wife doesn't think that's a good thing. So we'll get to 50, and then I'll go ahead and unveil the answer. Okay. So most people would let him leave. What actually happened was he was not allowed to leave. I put this up. Yeah, some of you will recognize this Cuckoo's Nest picture. Yeah, the youngish people will recognize this. I put it up in part because this, is a stereotype, right? What I'm showing you right here is a stereotype. This is what his facility actually looks like. And this is what most inpatient mental health facilities look like. But that's what happened to Jeff, is he was hospitalized. He was hospitalized for 5 days and was started on medication for bipolar disorder type 1 with psychotic features. And I just want to give you a quick rundown on the diagnosis of mania with psychotic features, in part because we have this tape that just takes each one of these criteria from the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, and we'll give you, an example. So we kind of played a little bit of this before, but this is inflated self-esteem. Whoops. Boy, you got to be fast with this.
I'm gonna win every fucking award there is, okay? Because I'm coming, and I'm coming in all fucking directions. I'm coming on the fucking video, I'm coming in television, I'm coming on the website. I'm coming at you so hard you don't know what to do about it.
And if you're curious what Jeff sounds like when he's not manic, this is Jeff today, or a few weeks ago when we were talking to him about this and describing what he felt at that time.
I'm working, and not sleeping. I'm working, 18 hours a day. I'm sleeping maybe 2.
Distractibility. So this clip, the phone rings as he's talking to someone, and it completely throws him off.
I kept coming to New York, the biggest city in the world. You know what they say? If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. Well, I made it in New York, and that fucking noise is killing me. You hear me? That fucking noise. They won't stop that fucking noise.
Right. I'm not going to play you all of the clips, but I will give you this clip of increased talkativeness, what we call pressured speech, in part because it's a terrific example of a phenomenon called echolalia. People with mania will sometimes speak in a sing-song way where they rhyme things over and over again. So this is an example of echolalia. Come on.
Come and catch me. You can't catch me. Nobody can keep up with me. You hear me? I can talk faster than anybody I know. I got the jive. I got the mive. I got the dive. Because it's win with zin, 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 zin. It's Tarzan.aol. It's Zin. It's Luzin. It's amazing. It's Anazin. You got a headache? I'm going to give you one. It's called Anazin. You want to give me shit? I'm going to come at you with the rope. It's called Tarzan.
So Jeff had all of the diagnostic criteria for mania. And as I said, he was hospitalized, but the episode I want to spend time on is episode 2. What happens in episode 2 is after his hospitalization, amazingly, he's got about $1 million in investments from external investors. These investors agree to continue to fund his new business if he'll agree to have a chief operating officer installed. And the purpose of this COO is to make sure he doesn't do anything, forgive the expression, crazy. And almost immediately, Jeff and the COO get into a conflict because Jeff believes that when he sits down with his buyers, people whom he's known for a long time, they will know he's different because he knows he's different. He's on meds now. He's acting differently. And he thinks he has to tell them, partly because they'll figure it out and wonder what's wrong, and partly because he thinks honesty is important, and partly because he doesn't want to contribute to mental illness stigma. This is a smart guy. And he sees that if he hides this, he will be just contributing to mental illness stigma. The COO says, "Don't you dare. You do not owe them anything. This is your private medical information. You don't need to tell anyone about it. And if you do, some of them, maybe all of them, will drop their orders. And this isn't just about you, this is about our whole company. And if you want to fight stigma, we'll make a donation to a mental health foundation. But we are not going to fight stigma one person at a time by you telling the buyers that you were recently hospitalized with your psychotic illness." So if you were Jeff, what would you do? You're not really sure whether you're thinking straight. You're only, a week out of a hospitalization for a mental illness. Your COO is saying don't, but your gut is saying I need to be honest. What would you do? Tell your buyers or not tell your buyers? All right, so we're 70-30, 65-35. So let's talk for a minute about this. And we're going to do the same thing we did with women a minute ago. What are some of the words that come to mind when you think about someone with a serious mental illness? And if you want to be specific, think about someone with manic illness. Because there are some both negative and positive stereotypes associated with mania. So what do you think are some of the words that people use? Intense, struggling, troubled, crazy, unpredictable, dangerous, traumatized, reckless, confused, troubled. So let me ask you a question. This is a standardized question from surveys that have been done nationally about stigma and mental illness. Do you agree or disagree that most people are generally caring and sympathetic to people with mental illness. If you agree strongly, press A, send in A, somewhat B, somewhat disagree, C, or if you strongly disagree, D. So I'll uncover this, but I'll also just note that there's a reason this question is phrased in the way it is, right? This question doesn't ask, are you generally caring and kind? It asks, are most people generally caring and sympathetic? And the reason for that is because this is not trying to get at you and your beliefs. This is trying to get at whether there is a stigma within the community, this unconscious, implicit, that's the sort of norm that you start with. And if you want to act against that, you're going to have to do it intentionally, right? This is a reflection of what do you see in the world around you? What is the fast way of thinking about this? So let me ask you a couple that are more personal. And again, these are standard questions that have been used in many surveys nationally and internationally. Would you be willing to have a person with a mental illness move in next door to you? Definitely, probably, maybe, probably not. Definitely not. All right, so we have about 15% would not, and the remainder would, so it looks pretty good in terms of a lack of stigma here. What about this one? How would you feel about someone with a mental illness marrying into your family? We talked to Jeff about this, by the way. He got divorced from his wife. Although not that fast, it took several years. And he had to make decisions about whether to disclose his mental illness to women that he would subsequently date. And he said the majority of the time, as soon as he disclosed, they would, not have another date. So this is our audience. I'll just show you the national data. So this is the proportion of people who would say unwilling. And there are a couple other questions that were asked here, but the ones that I showed you were move next door. So nationally, about 38% say definitely or probably unwilling. Marry into your family, it's a much higher number, about almost 70% say they would not be happy for that to happen. So what do you think, because remember we talked about how mental illness is invisible? So you have this option, right? If Jeff had a skin cancer that was growing on his cheek, he really wouldn't have a choice about disclosing that or not. This is not like that. This doesn't have a physical stigmata attached to it. So he has this choice of either telling people or not telling people and trying to pass as someone without a mental illness. And you'll recognize this term of passing from other contexts, I'm sure. But I want to ask you, what do you think what is the most harmful? And there's not a right answer here. There is data on all four of these. So all of these are effect of trying to pass as not having a mental illness when you do have one. What do you think is the most important one, is what I'm asking. So feelings of insecurity and exhaustion seem to be the most prevalent. And then one fact-based question, and then we'll wrap up. What % of people with a serious mental illness, so schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, what % of people with a serious mental illness will recover if they receive treatment? So what % of people who receive treatment will recover? So we have a pretty good spread of how people think about recovery in mental illnesses. So one of the remarkable things about mental illness is how treatable it generally is in comparison to many other conditions that we treat in medicine. So people with bipolar disorder who receive treatment, 80% of the time can recover. That stands in pretty stark contrast to, I'll just throw up hypertension, because I spent 5 years at the American Medical Association trying to improve our capacity to manage hypertension. And in this country, 40% of people with hypertension can't get it under control. Almost half don't have their high blood pressure under control. So by contrast, and if you look at something like pancreatic cancer, obviously much, much worse. So by contrast or by comparison, incidentally, this is one reason why some people have said that the real challenge in treating mental illness is not treating mental illness, it's the stigma. Because 40% of people with very serious mental illness, things like schizophrenia, are not getting treatment. And on average, people with a serious mental illness will wait 10 years before they seek treatment. And there are a number of reasons for that, but one of them is quite clearly that they don't want to receive the label of being someone with a mental illness. And in this way, the stigma is worse than the disease itself. So this is what Jeff is really balancing. The very real stigma and his desire to attack it and to be truthful. And on the other side are potentially the success of his business if, in fact, his chief operating officer is correct, and his medical privacy, which it is true, he does not owe anyone, right, to be honest about this. So just out of curiosity, I'm going to put up this one last question, which is the same question I asked you before. Having thought a little bit more about it, have you changed your mind? Or do you really, it's okay if you haven't. I'm just curious if anyone has moved in one direction or the other. And then I will tell you what Jeff actually did. Not much. Not much movement. Well, what I asked was, what would you do if you were Jeff? Anyone want to hazard a guess about what Jeff actually did? Has anyone listened to the podcast? So what did Jeff actually do? He told. Yeah, he told. And in fact, he still to this day says that his relationship with those buyers that he told got stronger. That the first woman that he told, one of the buyers whom he had known for some time, when he told her, she also had a close family history of dealing with a mental illness in the recent past. They really had a good talk about it. And there was no way she was going to drop her order. And if I remember correctly, she was the buyer for Dillard's, which, it was a big order. So they did very well in the first year of their business, and then things got complicated. So if you want to hear more, there are 5 episodes of Derailed. You can pull it up on iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher or SoundCloud, or you can go straight to our website, Hard Call Show, and listen to it. And that is my 30 minutes. Wasn't that an amazing talk? Let's give him one more round of applause. So now my job is to introduce you to Matt Vogel. I shouldn't have run to get this, because Matt specifically told me, do not use that, because it says things like he treasures bold ideas that are going to change the world.
Stop.
And he said, I'll give you $100 if you don't say that about me. So Matt Vogel is the executive director of the National Behavioral Health Innovation Center. Matt and his team were instrumental in the development and implementation of the Hard Call podcast around mental illness, Derailed. So I owe him a debt of gratitude, and you all will too after you see what he's about to show you. Matt?
I think so, yeah. Thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to be here. I got to do this event last year, and it was really one of the highlights of my fall, being able to do it. And then tonight, just especially to be here with Brenda and Matthew, who are two of my favorite people in this whole system. I've worked here for 20 years, and they're just two of the best, nicest, smartest people that I've ever met, and they're doing such incredible good in the world that I just adore them both. So it's really great to be here with both of you. And then my friend Kelly, when Brenda gave me the microphone and I left, I came back in and she said that the microphone was on and you could hear the toilet flush when I left. Did that actually happen? Epic. All right. You know, I just got a story I will tell till the day I die. Hopefully you heard me wash my hands and we're all good there. But it's kind of nice starting there because there's really only one direction I can go. So yeah, let's talk about virtual reality. I want to talk about, there's so much hype around virtual reality, and everybody's talking about its ability to influence empathy. And that's what I want to talk tonight, is to really try to cut through the hype and talk about what we know and what we don't know about the use of virtual reality and where we think the field might be going. And I did a talk back in June on a different aspect of virtual reality. And afterwards, this woman came up and she said, "You never told us what virtual reality was, you knucklehead." So I learned from that, and I'm actually going to explain a little bit about virtual reality first before we get into its ability to be an empathy building tool. So basically, in its simplest form, virtual reality is about putting somebody in a completely immersive environment. So if you dunk somebody in water, you're completely immersed, it's on all sides. And that's what happens with virtual reality. We strap a tiny little TV set or cell phone onto your face, and then in all directions, wherever we want to put you, on the moon, in a video game, under the sea, on top of a building, anywhere that we want to put you, you can be a part of that environment. And it's incredibly powerful. How many people have tried virtual reality? So a lot of you have, all right, that's great. And of the people who have tried, how many have done like a cell phone-based VR? And how about like a PC-based? Okay, so a few, that's great. So I'm gonna show, we'll do one little demonstration of VR generally in a minute, but as I mentioned, there are different kinds of virtual reality, so I'm going to use a lot of these interchangeably, but basically there's VR that your cell phone uses, which have the advantage of being inexpensive. They have the disadvantage because you can't really interact with the environment. And then there's PC-based, which is the HTC Vive, which we're going to use tonight, and the Oculus Rift. And those are much more robust, they're more expensive, but you can interact with your environment and do a lot more with them. So Brenda, why don't you come up here? Brenda has not tried virtual reality. And this is a very, very short, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, demonstration. But the point to this one, this is not an empathy building thing. This is just to show you the power of VR. And VR pretty much works based on the hierarchy of our senses. And so visual in almost every case trumps all of our other senses. So if I say to you, it's snowing in here, that's one piece of data, I've just said that. And then you look, there's no snow, and you say, well, you're a knucklehead. I'm going to go with what I see. And that's how virtual reality works. So even though Brenda will know that she's on the floor in this room, we're going to put, your glasses are fine, and we're going to put you somewhere else. Let's see. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Actually, my glasses are crunched.
Oh, I don't want your glasses crunched.
There we go.
Okay. Is that good? Mm-hmm. All right. And then if you hold your hands up, palms up, and just stay here for a second. And I'm going to, yeah, could you switch it, please? On the monitor, you're going to see what Brenda sees in the front of her field of view, but she will experience this in all directions. So we have her out on the city street, and if you take a couple steps forward, it should pick you up there. So are you seeing the street? So just stop there and look around in all directions, look up, enjoy the view. And the whole point to this exercise is to show you that VR is so powerful that it actually can produce physiological responses. So we're going to take Brenda now, and if you turn around, you should see an elevator.
Wait, my glasses are a little still crunched.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Here, let's see if
I
we
could
can.
take them off.
Yeah, let's try taking them off maybe.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So if you go ahead and turn around, you should see an elevator behind you. And walk slowly into the elevator. Okay, now turn around. And off to the right, you'll see some buttons. Take the controller, don't press any of the buttons on it, but just push the controller into the button that says plank on the top there.
Push it into
Yep.
it.
We're going to take Brenda to the top of a skyscraper about 400 feet above the street, and the elevator doors are going to open, and she's going to have a plank out in front of her that she can choose to walk out on or not. About half the people do. About the other half say, nope, I'm not getting out of the elevator, but I want you to pay attention to your heart rate, sweating, things like that. Oh, look at this. Very impressive. I'll tell you, the chancellor of this campus didn't get out of the elevator, so. That's great, you're doing well.
That's enough.
Okay, that's enough. So go ahead, why don't you turn 90 degrees? And then, there you go, and if you look down, you can see the street below. And if you want, just go ahead and walk back into the elevator. Good job. Yeah. Yeah, yes, you get the wow a lot. We hear a lot of expletives too when we do that. Thank you. Did you notice that your heart rate went up? Yes, and people start to sweat. So that's how powerful VR is. You intellectually, you know you're in one place, but it takes you to a completely different place. And we'll have the opportunity for people to come up afterwards and try it, or you can come to our center anytime that you want. So I want to talk about the hype. In 2014, there was a Time magazine cover with the guy who started Oculus Rift, and it said, virtual reality is about to change the world. And then Roger Ebert at the Sundance Film Festival coined the phrase, the ultimate empathy machine for VR. And all of a sudden, there was all this hype. And could it be that it would live up to that? Well, maybe. It might. But you got to remember, back in 2012, there was another electronic device that came out. And we were told ahead of time, Steve Jobs said it'll be bigger than the PC, and it's going to be bigger than the internet. The venture capital firm that was backing Amazon at the time said it will be the first company to reach $1 billion in revenue, and it will do to the car what the horse and buggy, or it'll do to the horse and buggy what the car did. Anyway, yeah, you can read that. I'm still thinking about the toilet, so. And they said, it will change the world. And what was this incredible world-changing device? It was the dumb scooter, right? Didn't exactly change the world. It did revolutionize how mall cops respond to disturbances in the food court, but it didn't exactly change the world. So the point is, we hear this a lot, that this new piece of technology is going to be world-changing. Take it with a grain of salt. That said, there is a lot of reason to believe that virtual reality is for real and here to stay. These are projected revenue for the VR industry. You can see that, just really it became commercially available just about 2 years ago, where you could actually go to Best Buy. And we're going to see exponential growth. And you look at this chart right here that's showing the breakout of what we predict will be some of the areas of revenue. Up in the dark blue, 5.1 billion this is in the year 2025, will be in healthcare. And there's all kinds of applications that are already being used. It's being used very effectively in chronic pain, stroke rehab, treating functional neurologic disorders, all sorts of mental health disorders, and PTSD. So talk about the empathy. The research in virtual reality and empathy has been going on for about 12 years now. And the majority of it early on was done in two places, at Stanford and then the University of Barcelona. And what they did was embodiment studies. And the embodiment studies is basically where they're doing body swapping, where they take a person and put them in a virtual environment where they look like somebody else, and then they would see how they would react, and then they'd measure what kind of impact that had on their biases and whether or not they felt empathy for that person. And the early studies really looked at implicit bias around age, race, ethnicity, and those three. And they showed good effects with age. They had a couple of simulations where they had somebody who saw themselves as an older version of themselves, and they were in a job interview, and the way that the job interview questions were going, it was pretty clear they were not going to get the job because of their age. And then they saw a very positive, statistically significant impact on their empathy towards older adults. There are a number of problems with these early studies. They were done with homogeneous populations, really just college students. Because virtual reality has only recently been commercially available, all of the studies were done at places with these very, very expensive machines. So they pretty much drew from undergrad students who were doing it for pizza money to come in. And so they you really had to take them with a grain of salt. And frankly, the results were a little bit disappointing early on, particularly when it comes to racial bias. The very first study that Stanford published on the subject showed that it actually activated people's stereotypes when white men were in it looking at themselves as an avatar of a black man, that it actually activated the stereotypes that they had held previously, and that their level of empathy went down, not up. So a lot of people were worried about that. Molly, do you want to come down here? I talked to Molly ahead of time. She hasn't tried VR either. You're not going to go on top of anything, so don't worry. What I want to show right now is just an example so that you have it in your mind as I'm talking about these studies. This is an example of the embodiment platform that Stanford and Barcelona used. This is a later version of it. Let me get these on you. And the quality has gotten better over the years. There's a new version that we haven't been able to get from them yet because they're still using it in some active studies. So go ahead. Is that comfortable for you? Okay, and if you want to hold your hands out, palms up, I'm going to put the controllers in your hands. Okay, so Molly's in a room here. Molly, if you turn to why don't you turn to your left? Oh, yeah. I have the wrong hands. Yeah. Okay, so turn to your left. Now, keep in mind, this is about 6 years old, so this, the graphics, are much, much better than they were initially. So what you do is, Molly's looking into a mirror now, and go ahead and move your hands, wave at it. Why don't you move your head side to side, and duck down, and now pop back up. And so we can make Molly an African-American woman. I could also change, and there she could be a blonde woman, or we could make her a white male, John Goodman from Big Lebowski, or a black man. And what they would do is they would have people interact in front of the mirror for about 6 minutes at a time because they wanted to get something called presence. And presence is where you actually start to say, I'm taking on the characteristics of this. I'm basically accepting what I'm seeing, that I am this person in the mirror. Now, if you don't take the time to do that, which we're not going to do today because we only have 30 minutes, then the effect isn't strong, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. It leads to something called the Proteus effect. But then what they would do is once somebody had accepted that what they were seeing in the mirror was real, then they would introduce a stressor, and in this case, it would be a man behind her, and you can go ahead and turn around, Molly, and see the guy. We don't have the audio, but depending on the character that was in it, this guy would be saying some really racially insensitive comments, yelling, threatening the person, or in the case of the woman, he was making sexually suggestive remarks and advances on her. So early on in these first studies, they found that it actually activated stereotypes for white men who were going through this. But in later studies, as the graphic quality got better, and they learned that they needed to have people spend more time in front of the mirror to really get the effect, they started to see the opposite, that it actually was having the intended effect, and that we were having a decrease in implicit bias. The question, of course, is did the effect remain? So I'm going to go ahead and take those off. So like I was saying, with the later studies, a number of things happened that made them better. One is we had improvements in the software and the hardware. The graphics got better. Early on with the old avatars, people just didn't buy it. They didn't buy what they were seeing. And it led to something called the Proteus effect. And the Proteus effect is basically when you're interacting, when you create an avatar of yourself in an online environment, whether it's playing on a video game or in Second Life or in a virtual environment, that you start to take on some of the characteristics of that avatar. So if you have an avatar that's really tall and attractive, you start to act more confidently. You start to get closer to people rather than maintaining a distance. And they found that the same thing was happening to people when they were in the old, poor graphic quality simulations. The studies were still homogeneous. They have made a lot of efforts, but until recently, most of the studies are still done on college students. And they found that attitudes changed, but the question has been, does it change behavior? Well, that's a really tough one to measure. And we don't know to what extent it changes behavior with respect to race, gender, ethnicity, and age. What we do know is that VR can have some very powerful effects on human behavior change in some other areas related to empathy. So for example, the one at the top is a simulation of color blindness. And so they had one group read about colorblindness, another group went into a virtual environment and experienced what it's like to be colorblind, and then they asked them to help a person who was colorblind do some research about resources in the area. The people who had gone through the virtual experience spent twice as much time on the internet trying to research with the person that needed the help. And the one over here with the guy in the plaid shirt, it was called the Superman experience. And what they did with that is they had two groups of people that came into a city. And the first group, they said, okay, you're in a helicopter and we're going to do a tour of the city. You're sightseeing. And they just flew them around. The second group, they said, there was a natural disaster and the baby got left behind and you have to go find it. And they flew through the city for 10 minutes to find the baby, found it, and then brought it out. Then afterwards, they knocked over a table with some supplies on it and things. And the people who had done the Superman experience were twice as likely to help pick up all the stuff as the people that had not done it, just based on a 10-minute experience. Now here's the really interesting part, is then they came back 4 weeks later to fill out paperwork and pick up their check, and they found that the effect had actually sustained. As the people were coming out of the building, they had another research assistant that they hadn't met who stopped and asked them for directions, and those people were still twice as likely to help, even if they didn't know the campus and know their way around. And then in the last one, they had a deforestation paragraph that one group read. The other group read the paragraph, and they spent 10 minutes in virtual reality cutting down trees. And they knocked over some coffee, and the people used 20% fewer napkins when they went to clean it up. And they tracked their paper use for 3 months. And after 3 months, they still had a statistically significant difference in their paper usage. So this is really encouraging to us. Measuring behavior change around things that we have attitudes towards is tough, but these things give us a really good hope that we might be onto something with VR. So starting about 4 years ago, we started to see the first VR empathy-based experiences come to the mass market. And at the Sundance Film Festival, a woman, a filmmaker in Los Angeles, debuted these two films. The one on the top was called Hunger in Los Angeles, and it's an experience. I have it on our Vive. You can try it later if you want. And it's an experience of standing in line at a food bank. And a person in front of you has a seizure, and he falls to the ground, and people don't help. And in fact, some people use that as an opportunity to cut to the front of the line. And it had really, initially very powerful responses. It won an award at Sundance. People saying, that it made them cry and that they really felt the aggravation of being in that line. And then there was another group that really panned it. And they said it wasn't realistic enough. I didn't like the way the faces were. The bodies were the wrong size. The audio was distracting. And so there, that we still don't know, was that the result of just a fledgling effort, and it was one of the early films that was, or graphic experiences that was done this way, or was it truly just that there are some inherent flaws in VR. And it's still too young, we just don't know. The second one is called Project Syria, and it was the same development group that made it. And it's the experience of being in a Syrian refugee camp. This one was not as well received, in part because people, Syrians said the characters in it look like white Americans, and they found that it wasn't nearly as well received. Then 2 years ago, we moved into a new genre with virtual reality, and that's the 360 video documentary films that were designed to build empathy in a number of different areas. And these are primarily played on the cell phone. The New York Times has a huge library of them. The United Nations now has a library of them. Time Inc., all of their magazines, they have a whole series of these things. And it's everything from, a day in the life at an Ebola village that's suffering an Ebola outbreak, or this Clouds Over Sidra, which was also an experience in a Syrian refugee camp that was in Jordan, but it was actual video, and it followed a 12-year-old girl who was in that camp. Now, there's some interesting things that happen with this. The filmmakers were able to get it and show it at the World Economic Conference, which is an offshoot of the UN. That's the picture on the bottom. And it's a huge conference where basically it's a fundraising conference. And what they found was that at that conference, the revenue that was generated for the Syrian causes exceeded the estimates by 70%, and they raised $3.8 billion for these causes. So a huge increase. UNICEF then took 30-second snippets of that film, and they gave it VR headsets to their street fundraisers and had them show it to people. They found that their fundraising doubled by using this film. Amnesty International, the Clinton Foundation also reported tremendous increases by using virtual reality films. And PETA is using VR outside of zoos and places like SeaWorld to convince people not to go in. They haven't released their data, but they say it's been very, very effective. Raises another question. Is this just because VR is new and it's a novelty, or is there something inherently powerful about VR? And the answer is probably both, but we just don't know. There we go. The last area, which is brand new, is interactive video. And so this is taking the 360 video that you've probably seen on the Google Cardboard or things, like the Clouds Over Sidra, and taking it a step further. There's a company in Pittsburgh that we're actually working with, and they developed their prototype as a simulation where you're at a bus stop, and you're waiting for the bus, and you see an act of police brutality where they are harassing and then eventually beating up a black man. And the way that the thing unfolds, it's sort of like a choose your own adventure, if you know those old video games, where from time to time options of what you can say pop up, and then you say them out loud, and the voice recognition software will take you to different places in the video to either escalate or de-escalate the situation. And what was interesting when we saw them for the first time, I've done a lot of VR because this is a lot of the work that we're doing. When the cop in this scene turned and came to me and started yelling at me, and I said something on the response list that pissed him off, he pulled his gun and said, hands up, and instinctively, just reflexively, I put my hands up. And they said that about 70% of the people that experience this all put their hands up doing it. So it tells you just how powerful VR is at really putting you in that situation. My heart was racing when it was going on. So what's the current status of the industry? Well, right now there's an explosion of films and different experiences. Like I said, the New York Times, if you go to YouTube, there's probably 10 dozen films out there. Some of them very good, some of them not so good, but there are a ton of them. And it raises the problem is that there's been little to no evaluation of these films. Everything we hear is anecdotal on them. People say, oh, well, everyone was moved to tears. People told us how great it was and what an impact it had on them, but there's really been no formal evaluation. And of course, the film industry has always resisted any efforts, to actually evaluate their films in any sort of, methodologic way. But I think it's an area that if we are actually going to use these films in schools and things like that, we need to know if they're effective beyond just whether or not they raise money. Because raising money tells you that it had an effect initially, but it doesn't tell you whether that effect lasted. And that's really ultimately what we're after. Can you change attitudes and have that be sustained over time? So the body of research is still quite small on virtual reality. They're starting to do bigger studies, and now that the equipment is affordable, we can do studies with broader populations. The group at Stanford is doing a number of new studies, including one that's in the photograph on the bottom about an experience of becoming homeless. And you're a person that is forced to sell off some of your possessions after losing your job. And I won't tell the rest of it because I would invite people to come to our center if you want to be a part of that study and try it out. Google is doing an exciting project that we're working with them on implicit bias for police training about shoot, don't shoot scenarios. As I alluded to, there's just a lot of commercialization of products without any validation of them. So people saying, oh, I'm going to have an empathy building platform that I can use in diversity training with a corporation, and I'm just going to sell it. But those things haven't been validated at all. So we really don't know to what extent they're working. Another area where I think we're going to see a big explosion in the coming years is with professional training. Here on campus, there's a number of people that are working on building clinical empathy for nurses and doctors and dentists, looking at gender, race. People are using virtual reality as gender, race blind hiring, so that you can do an interview with somebody in a virtual environment and you don't see them and it changes the voice, so you don't know what gender they are. You don't really know how tall they are, whether they're attractive. You don't see a wedding ring or things like that, so that the interviews are done purely on the person's experience and qualifications for the jobs. Simulated patient interactions. The Department of Psychiatry has some exciting plans with that. Military is doing pre-deployment stuff, looking at some of these videos before they send people to a war-torn region to understand the culture of what's going on there. Again, hasn't been evaluated yet, so we don't know ultimately, whether that's going to be effective or not. And then there's some neat things happening with respect to mental illness simulations. There's a group that did an experience of what it's like to be schizophrenic. They had 100 people with schizophrenia who informed the development of this, and they did different iterations of it. And they would come back and say, okay, did we get it right now? And they say, nope, you got those parts right, but this part's wrong. They would go back to the drawing board and kept doing it until they got it right. And there's groups right now that are working on similar things for autism, and we're going to participate in a development of a postpartum depression one, where you can actually experience postpartum depression from the viewpoint of dad, mom, or the baby. So I'm almost to the end, but there's a number of challenges that we're facing as far as real-world implementation goes with this. So there's some exciting stuff, but we're not there yet as far as having it out in every household and every business and every school using it. As I've mentioned over and over again, there's just a real lack of user-informed, evidence-based content, and that needs to be really the focus of the industry, I believe. How do you get people to see it? You can put things on YouTube, but by and large, you're preaching to the choir. The people that are going to see those videos are not necessarily the ones that you really want to reach, we don't think. And so there needs to be some sort of plan for how you're going to actually get this. Some schools are starting to think that through, where everybody, or in businesses, those are probably the places where there's the best opportunity for widespread exposure to this. VR is still not adopted widely. There's I was encouraged by the number of hands I saw that have tried it. I think we're getting there. 6 months ago, there would not have been nearly that many. There's logistical concerns. You look at all this with the cords and the stands and everything that you need. It's not practical to put it in schools or in every clinic. We need more validation and evaluation. There's some things where, and I think that the Project Syria, when you see that, it's sort of like doing VR just because we could do it in VR. That there was really nothing unique or special about the fact that it was done immersively. So, we have to figure out a way to help educate consumers. Which are those things that, are really high quality and have evidence, and that we're, leverage what is great about virtual reality, and which of the ones are really just, sort of done just for the hell of it because we thought it would be neat. And we're still learning exactly why VR works when it does. We don't know for sure exactly what it is about the experiences that makes it most predictive. Is it, high graphic quality? Is it the ability to interact with the environment or things like that? And then, as I indicated, there's a lot of further research. That's the favorite university phrase, that further research is needed. But this is a brand new field and has incredible potential. So it's really important that we continue to build on the body of research that's already there, which unfortunately was done, on equipment that doesn't exist anymore, with college undergrad populations and very, very small ends. So we'd like you to come try it. Come to our center. That is the email address for Sarah Berry, who is our coordinator for all of the tours. We have a lab set up all the time for people to come in. We really believe that the more people that can try virtual reality, the better. We can show you some of the films, Clouds Over Sidra, the Hunger in Los Angeles, the Syrian experience. If you want to be a part of the study on the Becoming Homeless experience or any of the other ones, and of course the Plank, please make an appointment and come over. And then I'll hang around tonight afterwards for a while if people want to try it then. So, thank you.
I'd like to ask the three speakers to come over and be part of a panel. We're going to be asking questions and talking to you. So Matt, and Brenda, please come over. And I want to thank you all for coming. I think it was a great and very innovative program tonight. It was wonderful. Just to tell you, our next program is coming up, and given the opportunity to tell you that it is November 28th, and the three speakers next time will be Dr. Nanette Santoro, who is the head of OBGYN, talking on the topic, Help, Menopause has taken my waistline away. Dr. Marc-Andre Cornier talking about, is your brain to blame for overeating, and can we do anything about it? And Dr. Huntington Potter talking about Alzheimer's and what we can do about that. The focus is on the brain in many different ways, and I think it'll be a wonderful additional program. Again, thank you all. We're now going to have questions for the panel, and if people want to come over and try after we're done, if Matt wants to show you how to use his device, it sounds incredible. I'm afraid to try it. I'm afraid to walk off the plank, but now I want to, because Brenda did it. So.
I'm a high school English teacher, and I recently had a student tell me that she felt that my class was trying to teach her empathy, and you can't be taught empathy. And I really thought hard about that, and it seems very much that you all disagree. Is there a simple way that I could respond to her?
I can start, I suppose. So we get this a lot in medical training, and the reason we get it, reason we get comments like that is in part because we tend to take students who enter medical school with a pretty high degree of empathy, and over the course of 4 years or 8 years, we drive it out of them. And so on the one hand, that's terrible. On the other hand, it is a counter to what you're saying, right? If we can drive it out, then we can also foster it. So I think the evidence suggests that you actually can support and foster empathy. You may not be able to create it out of whole cloth, but I don't think you have to make it out of whole cloth. We are born empathic human beings. And what happens is we have experiences that cause us to become cynical and less empathic over time. But if you create a learning environment that supports it, it will blossom. In the same way that if we create a learning environment in medical training that suppresses it and creates cynicism, you can squash empathy as well. But to my mind, the answer to that is, well, if you believe that you can squash it, then you should also believe that you can foster it and help it to grow.
I would agree with that, and I think you hit an important point, which is what is the learning context, the environment you create. So I do a lot of training and professional development on diversity and inclusion, and I find that it has to start with me actually enacting from a place of empathy. So one of my ways of being in the world is empathy all around. So for instance, if I'm teaching about privilege, is have empathy for people who haven't been exposed to these issues in ways that I have, and also to slowly bring people into the conversation rather than an immediate sort of, rush into it. For example, how many of you are left-handed? All right. So those of us who are left-handed are probably pretty familiar with how privilege operates because the world has been designed for right-handed people. And so just beginning with that rather than jumping into white privilege, right, is a different approach. So I think the learning context and how you set that up is also crucial.
I love that. So it's not white privilege, it's right privilege.
Easy for you to say. Are you left-handed? Just depends.
I am white and right.
Oh, ooh, did you hear what he just said?
I got gifts coming from every direction. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. It was very informative. I recently attended a experience up in Boulder where the Doctors Without Borders had a refugee camp and a refugee experience that was walk through, participate, think through, act through, feel through. The simulation was extremely important to me and very emotional. I was just wondering if there's other ways of creating empathy in other kinds of scenarios, other kinds of simulations that are not necessarily mechanical.
Yeah, so I saw that when it was on the Washington Mall. I believe it's in Boulder now, right? Or it was recently? It's not anymore. It is an amazing exhibit. And so what it reminded me of was actually the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., which does a similar thing. So it's not high tech, but it is immersive, and it does ask you to take on someone else's identity for a period of time and to sort of walk in their shoes for a period of time. And I think, VR, it's a question you raised actually about how different is this really? Is it just sort of taking, something that a good novel does a pretty good job of right now, or a good movie is pretty immersive, and just adding a technological twist. So maybe this isn't going to revolutionize things, but it is. It adds something new. I don't know. What do you think? You want that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that virtual reality is just a tool, and so just like when we look at using VR to do exposure therapy to treat phobias, you can't just give somebody a headset and say here it is and there's spiders on it and now you're going to be cured of your. That's done in the context of a series of visits with your therapist. It might be that over the course of 6 weeks you might have that headset on maybe 30%, 20% of the time. So it really is just a tool to help things out. You can't just hand somebody a thing and say, "Oh, watch this 10-minute movie," and all of a sudden you're going to understand everything about this particular culture you're watching. It doesn't, and it obviously has limitations. So, for example, a virtual reality thing isn't going to tell you what it's like to experience generational racism, or to have had the cumulative effect of trauma from living in war-torn areas for your entire life, trauma after trauma after trauma, or things like that. So it's powerful, and that's why I had the silly slide of the segue up there. It's powerful, but anybody that tells you that this is the magic solution to something, don't believe them, because I don't think that exists for just about anything.
Yes, the discussion of virtual reality is really impressive and exciting in terms of the next frontier for science and better living through chemistry, if you will. I'm old enough to remember that phrase. But what concerns me, or I guess it's a question, I'm concerned about the ethics and the dangers of such a powerful tool. If you can do the kinds of changes or make the kinds of changes that you want to make, and that all sound really good to me. I'm all for mental health and for improving our empathy for each other and reducing bias, all of that. But I see or worry about whether or not there is an opportunity for some others who don't share those values or who want to increase other kinds of social, what should I say, mores, which may not be the ones that I want to see developed. Is there, what are we doing? Are we opening Pandora's box, I guess is my question, or is there some kind of sense of, I don't know, I'm not going to talk about more government regulation, but I'm thinking about ethics and values.
Yeah, you're very right to worry. I mean, it is, as Brenda will tell you, having just been up on that plank, it is incredibly powerful, and you really do believe that you are there in many of these experiences. And so anything that has that much power has incredible power to do a lot of good and incredible power to do potential to do a lot of bad. And so, Brenda, if you can imagine if you were in that kind of thing in a first-person shooter game with somebody shooting at you and you're shooting and seeing graphic violence, at that level of realism and that level of brain buy-in, there's no way that doesn't affect you. And you think about parents who might park their kids in front of this for 3 hours. It scares the hell out of me, to think about that. There's a lot that we don't know. We don't know what the sustained effect of having this screen, half an inch from your eyes for long periods of time is going to be. That's why all the stuff that we're working on is based on experiences that are 10 minutes or less, because we just don't know yet. Pandora's box is already open, and so the reality is that if there's money there, it's going to be open. And the video game industry, makes on an annual basis about 8 times what the motion picture industry makes. So we're talking about tons of money, and video games really is what's driving the development of virtual reality. Now, there's a good thing in that as well, that because of video games, it's now available, it's now affordable, that you can go and buy a headset for $50 and put your cell phone in it and experience some pretty amazing things. But we have to pay attention to the ethics, and whether that's that we need regulation, whether it's that we need a better rating system, or whether we need consumer education. I don't know, but I think we absolutely need to think those things through. And at the very least, any people who are parents need to think about the impact of this stuff on kids, and make sure that we monitor the content that they're consuming.
Hi. So I didn't want to interrupt. Okay. So one of the things that is often really frustrating for me is that conversations about women's issues, even in spaces that have been, explicitly carved out to talk about women's issues, women's voices and lived experiences can be marginalized, right? And so as I've experienced this session, and I thank you all, I think that the information and the experiences that you gave were very valuable, and I appreciate them on a personal level. But as I experienced this, I didn't hear a lot about women's health, right? And in the second presentation, the bulk of it was about a man's experience. And I'm wondering if you could spend some time talking about how that implicit bias and marginalization and things that kind of go hand in hand in that sometimes may impact this issue that we came here to hear about today.
Thank you so much for your question, which is crucial to thinking about these issues of implicit bias. And a lot of the research, I think most of the research currently is focusing either on gender and or race, some of the early and current studies. And they are pretty consistent in terms of gender bias, which is that notion of negative and positive, tending more toward, if we use the traditional binary, and by the way, when we start talking a continuum, you see also those notions of a hierarchy and a value system, masculinity, femininity, and anything that's not masculine. So there's a wealth of research, anything from, and also looking at intersections of identity. So thinking of women specifically, and the more of the categories of those categories that were on that chart about ways we have stereotypes. So mental illness and women, right? Then that's going to be compounded in terms of the potential for discrimination, the potential for certain kinds of healthcare, the potential for interactions between providers and patients, for family dynamics, for cultural dynamics. Again, if you also factor in things like religion, age, the more you compound those with those that are discriminated against, and if you foreground women for that, then you'll see the powerful impact of implicit and explicit bias.
I'll just say, I struggled with this actually in putting the talk together because I thought, the story we told was the story of a man, and yet I was invited to give a talk at a women's health conference, and how do I sort of reconcile that? And I don't have a great answer. I think the thing I sort of turn to often about these kinds of issues, because I also, for example, give a lot of talks about the legacy of medical involvement in the Holocaust. And I'm not Jewish, even though most of the people who work in that area are Jewish. And I give a lot of talks about racial bias in medicine, and I'm not a minority. And most of the people who do that work are themselves minorities. And I always kind of feel like I wish there were more people who looked like me who were giving those talks. Because if you leave it to women or to Jewish people or to minorities to recognize and address these issues, then you're sort of missing a big piece of the story. And in a pretty fundamental way, that's kind of unfair to leave it to the sort of victimized group to be the people who have to fix the problem. So I like talking about this kind of stuff, even though it's kind of uncomfortable to be a white guy talking about, minorities issues or women's health issues. But I kind of feel like it's people like me who created these problems to some extent. So it's my problem, right? It's not a women's problem. It's, in the same way I really don't think racism in medicine is a problem for black people to solve, even though they're the ones doing most of the research and giving most of the talks. It's really a problem for medicine to solve. It's about healthcare. It's about how doctors treat patients, how doctors treat each other. And that's, not limited to being interesting to people who are sort of being victimized by the current system.
A great question, and thank you. And, like Matthew, I struggled with it too. And, when I was looking at the research in virtual reality and empathy, most of the studies were done on either, based on ageism or racism. And there was just very little that's been done. I will say that, so it was frustrating. I had the same, sort of, anxiety, and then I reminded myself, I'm talking about the actual, ability of this tool to be able to help build empathy and to help have people experience what it's like to walk in a limited way in the shoes of someone else. But it also, as the executive director of this organization, it really, gave me pause to think, here's an area where there's a great need. And so I think, when I think about what we're going to do as a center, we're working with lots of these companies in California and in Pittsburgh and in Boston who are building content for these things. We're trying to help them build evaluation mechanisms and things like that. And they're consulting us on content, because there are a lot of companies that really do want to get it right. And it just gave me an issue that I really want to pursue with them, because I think I wouldn't have realized that there was such a dearth of evidence in studies around how this is being used around gender had I not done this preparation for this lecture. So in that respect, I'm glad I did.
So I have a question about this intersectionality that we brought up a minute ago. So when y'all think about the intersectionality of bias, implicit or explicit with regard to gender, and then this question of stigma, and when we think about, in some areas we have made progress, like people don't necessarily feel they have to hide the fact that they had cancer anymore, like they did when cancer was first being newly discovered and treated. So what do you think? What can we learn about any progress that we've made in either of those areas? and how can we get it better faster?
Could you elaborate on the question just a bit, please?
I just think about, we've made progress in stigma on some things, right? But not on others, not on mental health, for example, or we are slow to make progress. And I think the question of making the progress, it seems to me to be kind of related to this question of bias.
I think before this talk, I would have, for this evening, I would have said, I'm incredibly encouraged about the progress that we're making with respect to mental health stigma. I was on the cover of the Westward 2 weeks ago, a story about my own bipolar disorder and near suicide. And I haven't received, one negative piece of feedback. Through Facebook, it went worldwide, and I've had, over 300 emails from people, all of them supportive. I asked my 15-year-old if it was okay that we did the interview, and he said yes. He hasn't, I thought, oh, what if he gets teased or things like that? He said everybody thinks it's amazing. And then I see, Matthew's slide that says that, 68% of people wouldn't want me to marry into their family, which I sort of get after the microphone thing, but not because of the bipolar thing. And that, and then you see something like that, and man, it's like, wow, what a sock in the gut that is. So, sometimes I think maybe I delude myself into thinking that we're doing better than we are. I do think we're making progress. I think we're making a lot of progress, but man, do we have a long way to go.
I love that you brought up the cancer stigma issue, because I think many people don't know that. Don't know that, 50 years ago, cancer was not to be talked about. If you had cancer, it was embarrassing, today that just sounds weird. Like we don't, and I'm not sure if cancer went through a sort of process where first it was explicitly stigmatized, and then over a generation or two, it was only implicitly stigmatized. It was no longer socially acceptable to hold overt negative biases about people with cancer, but we still had those biases. We just couldn't say them anymore in proper, in good company. And now, eventually, a couple generations later, there really is not much or any stigma for many cancers. And maybe, this is a generational thing. Niels Bohr, the famous physicist, once said, "Science progresses through funerals." And it may be that there are aspects of the social environment that take 40 or 50 or 60 years to evolve and change. And that doesn't mean that we should be complacent, but it does mean that it's going to take time, even though we are working explicitly on it. Which, by the way, reminds me that it's easy for me to say that because I'm a white guy who doesn't face the stigma, right? So this is something that is very common in surveys of people about their experiences of discrimination and so on. People who are white tend to see how far we have come. And people who are not tend to see how far we have yet to go. And it's not that exactly one of them is totally wrong and the other is totally right. Both have some degree of accuracy to them, but it does reflect that, what you see is a reflection of where you stand.
And the data, the evidence is you cannot deny. We talk specifically about mental illness and gender for women. And again, it's compounded in terms of if you're also poor, if you're also a woman of color, if you're LGBTQ, et cetera, that data is undeniable in terms of the extreme. And back to the research shows differential diagnoses in terms of gender, if we think about mental health and other aspects, if we think about the types of treatment and whether or not who provides what kind of treatment. And by the way, this does not vary according to the gender of the provider. And that point I made earlier is one to keep in mind. We've, again, foregrounding gender, but I like to talk about our identities as intersecting because oftentimes, for one, if we say gender, we tend to think we're talking only about women, but we're all gendered. For two, when we think about identity, if you think about my hand as this multifaceted gem, that's all of us. And there are times when we necessarily need to foreground one facet, but even as we do, we need to not lose sight of the others because that's where we see particular implications for anyone who's in healthcare professions is to recognize that compounded potential for discrimination and differential treatment, both implicit and explicit. That also has implications for the kinds of professional training we're giving, the sort of, again, one of the ways to get better at this is to learn more about the specific research that's relevant to your area. And in the notion of gender and medical care and implicit bias, there actually is a wealth of research.
I want to thank everybody. That's the last official question we have time for. This has been an incredible program. I want to thank our colleagues at the Medical Center of the Rockies up north. Thank you all. You've been here the whole time. I hope you can hear me and hear me thanking you. And thank all of you for coming tonight, and what a great session. See you soon.